Many of us, probably most of us, have had some painful experiences in life. Usually they are around some kind of loss. Loss of a job, loss of health, loss of a time in our lives that we loved but is gone. Loss of things that we took for granted and thought were sure and that we were certain about. It gets more painful when it's losses of relationships, friends, family, maybe even a marriage. And particularly painful when those losses are because of death. Most of us have had those kind of experiences, and if we haven't, then we probably will someday. And they're challenging. They challenge us on all kinds of levels, but they oftentimes challenge our faith. Sometimes people even lose their faith when they go through those kind of painful experiences. So they happen to us. And they also happen to people around us that we care about. So let's just face right into that today and walk right into that difficult question. There's two ways of looking at life that run through the Old Testament scriptures. The first one, maybe I will call actions have consequences. If you do the right things, things come out well for you. If you don't do the right things, things don't come out well for you. Makes sense? It's a simple calculation. Actions have consequences. And most of the time, and lots of time in life anyway, that's the way it works. You plan, you work hard, you do the right things come out well. You don't do those things don't come out well. That makes sense for a lot of life. Until it doesn't sometimes. We all know that there are good things that happen in our lives and other people's lives that we don't deserve. And we don't even know how they happened or why they happened. But it's the flip side of that really gets to us. It's when we have done all of the right things and it doesn't work out. It all falls apart. And something rises up inside of us, whether it's then or those painful experiences that I was talking about, and something in us says, it's not fair. So there's another way of looking at life that runs along through the Old Testament. The first one, actions have consequences, kind of says that what life is about and what we should do is to try to do the right things and not do the wrong things. But there is another way of looking at life that flows alongside of that in the Old Testament, and it basically comes down to this. Life is pretty random. It's not always fair. And in the end, we all die. And the question for us in that way of looking at life is, how can I live a human and happy as possible life when that's the way things are? They're both there. They run alongside of each other, those two ways of looking at things throughout the Old Testament. And sometimes one fits the way life is going, and sometimes the other one fits the way life is going. And the ultimate example of the second one, the life is random and not fair, and we all end up dead, and how are you going to live with that? The ultimate example of that is what we heard today, the story of Job. Let me remind you, most of you probably know, but let me remind you of how the story builds up to the reading that we heard a few minutes ago. It's a fable, and in this fable, God and Satan are kind of looking down at people on the earth, and God says to Satan, "So what do you think of my servant Job? He's a wonderful, faithful man, and all kinds of great things are going on in his life. And Satan says, well, how faithful do you think he'd be if things weren't going so well in his life? Give me a chance to go down and mess his life up and see what he's like. And God says, okay, you're on. So everything starts going wrong in Job's life. He loses his massive fortune. His children all die. And finally, he becomes sick with a horrible disease. Now, his friends come, supposedly to comfort him, and they sit with him for a while, but usually what they say is some version of that other actions have consequences way of looking at life. They kind of say, Job, this is probably your own fault somehow. Must be you did something wrong to have all these terrible things happening in your life. And we know, as the readers of the story, that that's not true at all. Job's not done anything wrong. And he keeps saying, blessed be God, blessed be the name of the Lord. He keeps being faithful in the midst of all this, and all of his friends who are coming insinuating that's his own fault. And then finally, he has had enough, and he just turns to God and he says, God, what is up with this? That's where today's reading comes in. God kind of says, well, let me ask you a question. Where were you when I created everything? In essence, God is saying to Job, this is way bigger than you can understand. And as I've come to ponder this during life, I've come to the conclusion that that's really the only answer we ever get to why these painful things happen in our life. It's bigger than we can understand. Now, that can be a kind of unsatisfying answer, especially if it makes God seem like some, petulant power trip going on. But if we just pay attention, it goes deeper than that, because this is God who is saying that. This is God who has created the universe. This is the God who brought the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. It's this God who's saying that to Job and to us. You're just not able to understand everything and why and how it happens. But it's God's work that's going on. Well, that's better, but it even gets better for those of us who are Christians, because we would understand that God's work comes to its fulfillment and focus in Jesus. And Jesus took on all of the suffering and pain himself in the cross, and then through the cross to the resurrection, and then took all of that into God. And so the God who is at work in the things we don't understand is a God who totally understands suffering and pain. Among the many images that I carry from the past year and a half or so of the pandemic, things that happened, one just stands out for me that made a deep, deep impression on me. It happened back in late March of last year. Pope Francis decided at that time, and we have to remember, you'll probably remember, at that time, the pandemic hadn't hit here real hard, but it was horrible in Italy, just horrible. It was out of control. They were in the north part of Italy. They were unprepared. People couldn't even get to the hospital before they died. They were dying in the streets. Everyone was locked into their homes. They could not come out. All they could do was look out the window and see the ambulances going by. It hadn't gotten like that here, but we, looking at that over there, were wondering what might be coming. So at that very moment, the Pope decided to do what is called an urbi et orbi blessing, a blessing of the city and the world. For him, the blessing of the city of his diocese, Rome, and of the whole world. Now, normally he does that blessing on Christmas and Easter. And they're great festive events in St. Peter's Square. There are bands playing. There's tens of thousands of people there. It's a holiday atmosphere. They're waving flags. They have banners. They're cheering and singing songs. And the Pope comes out and gives this blessing from the balcony up above. But this was different. He did the blessing at night. No one could leave their home, so there was no one there. Just a couple of other priests who were around to kind of help this happen. And instead of being up on the balcony, he was down on the ground of the square with just a little tent over him. And it was pouring down rain. Everything was soaking wet. It was dark, rainy. And here's this man in his 80s, all alone in the midst of this gigantic public square in a country that was terrified, to give a blessing to the city and the whole world. It's a powerful image. I'll probably never get it out of my mind. The gospel he chose for his sermon on that occasion, the sermon he preached to nobody and to everybody, the gospel he chose was the very one we had today. The story of the great storm on the Sea of Galilee and the disciples being in the boat and being terrified, and Jesus is sleeping, and what is going on here? Don't wake up, don't you care about us? And then Jesus wakes up and calms the storm. And the Pope used that as an image. He said, that's where we all are. We're all in the boat together. The pandemic is a great storm all around us. And we've discovered we're in this boat together. And we're learning some things by being stuck in this storm, in this boat together. We're learning that the way we were living is good for a few people and not very good for a lot of people. That's just been laid bare before us. We're learning that there are people that we utterly depend on that we were completely neglecting, like healthcare workers and the people who work in the grocery store. We're in this boat together. We're in this awful storm. And when Jesus wakes up, he says to us what he said to the disciples, where's your faith? Why are you so afraid? Now, the Pope went on to say that doesn't mean that if we have faith in Jesus that there's never going to be a storm or the storms we're in are going to just magically disappear. It goes deeper than that. It goes to what I said a moment ago. The faith that Jesus calls us to is the faith in the one who died on the cross and rose from the dead and took on our suffering and pain. And if we can trust that, then we're going to find that we can live, even with our painful experiences, even if they don't go away, even if we don't understand them. We're going to find that we can be the kind of people that Paul talks about in today's epistle. People who he said are dying, but see, we live. People who are as though we're being punished, and yet we're not killed. People who are always sorrowful, and yet always rejoicing.